So I have a question for you. Where do you go? What do you do when you need to find comfort, when you need to find peace and assurance? Where do you go? Where do you go? In 1963, Brian Wilson said this: "There's a world where I can go and tell my secrets too. In this world, I lock out all my worries and my fears. Do my dreaming and my scheming, lie awake and pray. Do my crying and my sighing, laugh at yesterday. Now it's dark and I'm alone, but I won't be afraid." Where? In my room. One person, thank you. Thank you. We had a bunch at 8:30 knew that one, by the way, but thank you. All right. In my room. Beach Boys. Anybody remember the Beach Boys? There was a documentary. Really had a documentary on Netflix, or Disney, or wherever the heck it was. I can't remember where it was. I watched it. It was great. All right. Beach Boys. Beach Boys. In my room. And I don't know, there's a number of teenagers in here today, and I think the rest of us used to be teenagers. Do y'all remember those days? All right? And probably not much has changed since a lot of us have grown up. But when things got a little chaotic in our house, when our parents were nagging, which are basically the same thing, right? Chaos, parents nagging, pretty much the same thing. Well, where do we go? We go to our room. We would escape to our room. Now, my room in my house was actually right next to a bathroom, right next to the kitchen, right next to everything. My brother and sisters, their rooms were in the very back of the house, so they had a little more advantage than I did. That they literally could go to the back of the house and they could really escape. But I couldn't. I was sort of like right in the middle of the house, but still closed my door. And back then, back in the 70s and early 80s, I had a turntable. Okay? All right? We played records on those, for those of you up there. These were records. They were like Frisbees, right? So they were records. All I had was a record player. I had a console, actually. I had a console and played records. Now, back during those days, before Spotify, before Pandora, before Sirius, before Apple Music or whatever, you literally had at your disposal only what you bought, only what you could afford. And during those days, most of the music that we bought, if y'all remember, was probably music that our parents would not want us to listen to. There was not a whole lot of gospel music that we would purchase, right? It was not there. That didn't come along till the 80s when I started college. That's sort of when the Christian music scene came on, and that's when I started buying the Christian contemporary music, Amy Grant, Michael W. Smith, back those days. So I didn't have much to choose from as far as being what you would say positive music, right? So there was those days when I would go to my room and Pink Floyd would show up. All right? Pink Floyd. When things didn't go great at school. We don't need no education, right? I would listen to that. Right? And that wonderful song, every now and then, Comfortably Numb, would put that on there. So, not a lot of positive music that I listened to then in my room. I got to my room in college, things changed. I got a little more positive music that I would listen to. But we all have to grow up. I know you don't want to believe that, but we all have to grow up. And many of us have grown up. And when we're seeking that comfort, when we're seeking some place to find peace, we can't go to our room because somebody's going to barge in. Maybe our spouse, maybe the kid that doesn't know anything about private space. So what do? If we want peace and we want comfort, we leave. We go out. Or in Bridget's case, here, children's ministry, take them, right? That's what Bridget's doing. we go out. And in the United States, you know what Americans do for comfort? Usually one of three things: pizza, burger, or ice cream. Right? The surveys show when we are looking for comfort food, we're going to choose, half of us are going to choose pizza, or half of us choose burgers or ice cream, or all three, right? Depending on the situation. We're going to look for something to give us comfort. All right? So how am I going to tie this into Jesus? Give me a second. All right? Give me a second. So when we think about Jesus, here's what we know about Jesus' life. Not much until he burst onto the scene. Around December time, we start talking about when Jesus came to this world. We start talking about his birth. We have a number of references to how he was born, when he was born, what went on in those early years, up to about 3 or 4 years old, when they came back from Egypt. So we have a good amount of information about those early years, and then almost silence until he is baptized by John and goes in the wilderness for 40 days. But one glimpse of Jesus when he was 12 years old. And that glimpse of Jesus was, they had made a yearly trek to Jerusalem, and they went home and he wasn't there. In fact, he was still in Jerusalem. When they found him, he was in the temple. So this is the only instance we have of what happened during Jesus' early years before we know a whole lot about him when he was around 30. And in those 30 years of the unknown, we have to take an educated guess. We have to sort of extrapolate what was going on. It's like one of the things that we believe went on is that he carried on his father's trade. His father was a carpenter. And carpenter, we think of carpenter today as being all wood, and that's not the case at all. It was a lot of carving out of stone and stuff too. So he was probably doing that in his dad's workshop or business. He was probably learning all that trade, which was not an easy trade. It was not a white-collar job. It was a blue-collar job. And with that reference, when he was 12 years old, he said, where would you expect me? We get the indication that Jesus grew up following the rules of the Jewish religion and the Jewish tradition. So that's what we believe that went on for these 30 years of sort of the unknown about Jesus. That he was a very good Jewish person, followed all the rules, did everything he was supposed to, spent as much time as he could during those festivals in the temple, learning, listening. And then we get to the end of his life. Well, let's go. We get to those when he burst on the scene after he's baptized, wilderness for 40 days. Then he surrounds himself with 12 disciples. And what he does is he starts teaching and he starts healing and he starts preparing his disciples for what's next. They didn't know it, but what he was doing, he was mentoring them, discipling them for what life was going to be like without him. They didn't know what he was doing, but that's what was going on. And plus, all these people got to hear him and got to experience his teaching and his healings. So we come at the end of Jesus' life, the end of Jesus' earthly life. He is literally hours away from being arrested, tortured, crucified. Literally hours away. And what do we find? Matthew 26. On the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover? Now, what's significant about this passage is this. It was assumed. They didn't say, if Jesus, are we celebrating Passover this year? They didn't say that. There was no if to this. This was assumed. Jesus, we know we're going to celebrate Passover, so where do you want it to take place? Where do you want this Passover to take place? As much, now remember, if you're reading through the Bible with us, we've been reading through Matthew the last couple weeks. And in reading through Matthew, you know what you find? You find Jesus attacking the very religion that he is following. You understand this? And he's attacking basically the religious leaders. He was not attacking them for their religion. He was attacking them because of the way they were going about practicing their religion. The religion itself, he didn't have a problem with. The leaders and how they were pushing it and representing it to the people, he did have a problem with. And so the very religion that he was talking about the leaders of, he still followed. Particularly this one, Passover. Steve says to Passover for Jesus was not about what religious leaders were teaching and telling people they had to do. No, Passover had to do with this great big remembrance, the biggest of all days in the Jewish tradition. And that, to him, was important. Now, here's the context of this passage, right? The context of this passage, Matthew 26. And if we're reading sort of chronologically the way that Matthew puts this, Matthew 26, the beginning of this said this, verse 1 says, when Jesus had finished saying these things, he said to his disciples, as you know, the Passover is 2 days away, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified. 2 days before the Passover. Jesus has just told his disciples, by the way, I'm going to be crucified. Now, Matthew does not record the disciples saying anything. No response, nothing. Okay? But understand the context even further. Because that passage in 26 says, after Jesus had finished saying these things, what had he just said? Well, Matthew 25, verse 31, Jesus said, when the Son of Man comes in his glory, it'll be like the parable of the sheep and the goats. He told this story about the sheep and the goats. And the sheep were those who saw Jesus and the poor and the needy or whatever, and the goats were the one that ignored them. Okay, that's a really quick summary. But he said this at the end of that parable. They will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. He said the goats are going to eternal punishment, but the sheep are going to the sheep are the righteous, and they're going to eternal life. So the context seems to indicate this, that Jesus is saying, okay, Son of Man is going to be crucified. He has to be crucified because the Son of Man is going to come in glory. The only way he can come in glory is to be crucified, and the only way that the righteous can have eternal life is for all this to take place. So all this is coming in. That's the context of this time. But understand that as he's saying this, I want you to understand the state of Jesus at this point. He was getting ready to go through the most emotional, mental, and physically exhausting, taxing time he had ever had. The 40 days without food and water was nothing compared to what was about to take place. So chaos was coming. Chaos was coming to his life. And what did he do? He celebrated the Passover. He celebrated the Passover. Which means what Jesus was leaning into was when the chaos was coming, when things were looking bleak, he was looking to find comfort and peace in the familiar. He was looking to find peace and comfort in the familiar. We can too. We can find comfort and peace in the familiar as well. But here's the deal. For something that is familiar to bring peace, we have to have something familiar, All right, we have to have that in our life. But here, familiar is a broad term, right? But what Jesus was focusing on, he was familiar with the Passover. He was familiar with something that was positive. And I'm wondering if so many of us are getting so familiar with things that are negative. I wonder that. I wonder if we are getting too familiar with things that are negative and not positive. We've learned that people with addictions keep going back to it. It's familiar. It's familiar. And they keep going back, even though it's destructive, even though it's harmful, they keep going back to it. Can we, when we look at something that's familiar, can we start looking at what is positive and not negative? You see, not only did Jesus turn to the Passover, I want you to hear this in Luke 4:16. What he was finding comfort in the familiar. What's some other places? I want you to hear this. Jesus went to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went to the synagogue, as was his custom. As was his custom. Jesus went to the synagogue 20 times in the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. 20 times it's mentioned that Jesus was at the temple or at the synagogue, places of worship. About 20 times he did this. That was familiar to him, right? Jesus, we even have this recorded in Matthew 26 after he was arrested. Basically saying, every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, you didn't arrest me then. In other words, I was there every day. Because why? It was my custom. It's my custom to be in the temple courts, to be at the temple. I was there in plain sight. You could have come and done this anytime. Why'd you wait till tonight? Why'd you wait till tonight? So what is familiar to you? Friday, I went to a graveside service for a man. He had been part of a church, not in this area, but he'd been part of the church for 40 years, and one of his pastors from that church had come down to conduct the graveside and have military honors and stuff like that. And if you've ever been to funerals, and majority of you probably have been to funerals, I tend to go to more than everybody else. I don't know why, but anyway. One of the things that we do at funerals is we say things that are familiar. And if you've been to more than a handful of them, you actually hear things over and over and over again. Some of the same things over and over again. And that was the case in this service. There was a moment where the pastor said, I want to read a very familiar passage that actually provides comfort. And he said, as I read this, if you want to join in, please do. So he starts reading the 23rd Psalm, and literally everybody around started reciting that with him. Why? It was familiar. Again, this gentleman had been part of a church for 40 years. The majority of the folks that were at this service also had been a part of that church or another church for a long period of time. So this was just sort of a natural thing that everybody just said it along. What is familiar to you? What is familiar to you? If you simply show up for a service every now and then, there may be things that aren't familiar. You don't have a frame of reference. Some of the things that are familiar to those of us who have been a part of following Jesus a long time is maybe John 3:16. Those of us who grew up in church will probably remember the Lord's Prayer or the Apostles' Creed. Those seems to be familiar. Some of you would recognize songs that are sung over and over again. You may recognize some of those songs and can sing them from memory or by heart. When Jesus chose to take the Passover as the last thing he was going to do, it was the familiar. And then what Jesus did on that Passover with his disciples, he tweaked it a little bit, right? They had their meal. They went through all the cups of Elijah, everything that you go through during a Passover Seder meal. They had done all that. But at the end, at some time in the meal, he took some bread and broke it. And then he passed around a cup. And he made this Passover meal into something different that is now familiar to us, the church. And then when he goes back to Passover and wants to celebrate the Passover, it's really all about, when you think about it, about what's getting ready to happen to him. You know what actually the Passover is a celebration of, a reminder of, is this: when the future doesn't look promising, turn to the one who promises. When the future doesn't look promising, turn to the one who promises. That's what Passover is all about. Here's a quick history lesson. Exodus 6:6. God said to Moses, "Therefore say to the Israelites, I am the Lord. I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment." You know what happens after that? 9 plagues come to Egypt. 9 plagues. And then, before the 10th plague comes, there's a special instructions that come through from God to Moses. Say, hey, tell the people, you got to plan like this. You got to prepare a lamb like this. You got to do unleavened bread, all this other stuff. Oh, by the way, as you kill the lamb to cook it before this meal, don't forget to put the blood on the doorpost or outside where you're living, because number 10's coming. And so the 10th plague comes. 10th plague. We got, to this day, then this happened. So the plague, right before the plague happens, they were told this. And so 9 had happened. Here's the instructions before the 10th plague. This is a day you are to commemorate for the generations to come. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance. So right before the angel of death came upon Egypt and technically passed over Israel because of the blood on the doorpost, even before this had happened, he said, oh, by the way, you're going to commemorate this day. You're going to commemorate this day. And then it reminds them again, many years later, reminded again, Deuteronomy says this: observe the day of Aviv and observe the month of Aviv and celebrate the Passover of the Lord your God. Because in the month of Aviv, he brought you out of Egypt by night. So that's what Jesus is remembering and celebrating, that he was looking at this. When the future doesn't look promising, you turn to the one who promises. Jesus was in that moment when things were at the bleakest, when he knew his life was going to be very taxing and draining and literally life sucking out of his body. I'm going to turn to the deliverer. Why? Because he already promised he would. He already promised he would, and he's already done it once, and so he'll do it again. But not only did he turn to the deliverer, to God during the time of Passover, he went to Gethsemane. Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane and said to them, sit here while I go over there and pray. All 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, also mention the same thing, that Jesus went to Gethsemane to pray. Because why? Because when the future doesn't look promising, turn to the one who makes the promises, right? So he is turning to God in prayer. John 17 even records a longer prayer that Jesus had. So when things were the bleakest, when there was so much uncertainty, where do you turn? Where do you go? Do you simply just have, I'm going to go to a worship service. I'm going to listen to something. I'm going to read a verse. I'm going to read the Bible. What are you going to? What are you turning to? I don't know. This is not a well-kept secret. Do y'all know that Easter and Christmas Eve are the biggest attended Sundays? Did y'all know that? Baffling, isn't it, right? These are the biggest days, right? When you go back to the Jewish time, there was these big festivals that everybody went to. So we have a big festival. Easter Sunday and Christmas Eve. Those are our big festivals. And we'll double, sometimes even triple our average attendance on these days. As much as Jesus celebrated those big days, what was his custom? His custom was to be in the temple. He told those who arrested him, I was here every day. I was here every day. Why? Because it was his custom. You know, when you put yourself in a position day in and day out, that position becomes a part of who you are. Let me give you an illustration. 18-year-old. For 18 years, 18-year-olds, this 18-year-old grew up in a family that followed Team A. And they all supported Team A, college-wise. University A. They supported that team. Everybody was behind them. They watched the games. They went to the games. They did things, not just during football season, but all the time. They were sold out to this university. 18 years old, he graduates. But he wants to go to University B. You know what happens? Pretty quickly, who's he cheering for? Who's his team now? University B. Because he's putting himself into position every day, day after day, and he's influenced and will turn to that team. You see, here's the deal. You got to be familiar with something positive for the familiar to bring you peace. See, if you're not familiar with the things of God, you can try a whole lot of things that you are familiar with, but they're not going to bring you peace. They're not going to bring you comfort. It's going to be like me going back and listening to a stinking Pink Floyd song expecting to find comfort there. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. I don't care if they say it's comfortably numb. I'm not comfortable, right? It's not making me comfort. I don't have comfort there. It's not going to bring me peace. I'm going to show you pictures of four famous, sort of famous men. Some of you, two of them are sort of famous. The other ones are not. But you may recognize Jeremiah Denton, Howard Rutledge, Ernie Brace, and John McCain. These were all POWs during the Vietnam War. Jeremiah Denton, 8 years. He was a prisoner of war. We know him because he was one of our senators for years. John McCain was also 8 years. Okay? Here's the deal that sort of binds all these together. Jeremiah Denton said for those 8 years that he was in prison, what got him through was the Lord's Prayer and verses of the Bible that he had memorized. Howard Rutledge said it was verses of the Bible he had learned and hymns that he had learned. Ernie Brace was sort of the outlier in this group. Ernie Brace was a civilian at the time. He had been dishonorably discharged from the Marines, and he was a civilian pilot. He was the longest POW civilian, still is technically, in the United States. He didn't have much faith, but he found faith in prison because he knew how to pray, and somehow he had got a hold of the 23rd Psalm. But what really saved Ernie was he went to Hanoi Hilton. His cell was right next to John McCain. They were celled by each other for a long time. Never met face to face until after they both were released. And if you've done any history research about Hanoi Hilton, they didn't allow contact with each other, but they had a code. They started tapping out. And they shared, all these prisoners in Hanoi Hilton shared scripture verses, hymns, whatever it was, that they all could memorize. They pieced together all these different, in this communication, pieced together all these words of comfort and of hope to bring peace to them. And that's how all four of these guys said that's how they survived. That's how they found comfort and peace in a very bleak situation. Where will you go for comfort and peace? Where will you go for comfort and peace? Well, you're going to go to the familiar. But will that familiar bring you comfort and peace? If you don't have a familiar that brings you comfort and peace, how about today you start? How about today you start and find something that's familiar, that's of God. And one of those things that we do regularly here is offer you the Lord's Supper. And I hope in these moments that Bobby leads us through, that you will find peace and comfort in this momentary act, the small act of worship. But don't let this be the beginning and not the end. Find what brings peace and comfort, and may that familiar be things of God. Bobby.